We see people at parties taking pictures with old Polaroid cameras instead of just using modern cameras, VHS filters, 80s, 90s recreations, and all the revivalism in general. Everything is consumed and produced by millennials, but also by a huge part of Generation Z.
It's certainly true. If you look at like vaporwave mixes on YouTube or something, and you look at the comments, it's all people who are like, I'm 22 and I don't remember Fleetwood Mac at all, but this remix is great. I love this.
Nostalgia for stuff that you're too young to remember is just, part of the mainstream now.
Historical nostalgia is your longing for the past that lived before you were born. I think this is also a very fascinating area of nostalgia. If I'm right, it's less explored.
Nostalgia in the film is comforting.
Chippendale Rescue Rangers, the show that defined a generation.
It makes perfect sense to see the film industry aiming at an audience that relates to the content they grew up with.
I appreciate all the cameos.
It hits you exactly where it needed to.
Revivals of the 1980s and 90s are mainly a result of the nostalgia cycle we already talked about. But why exactly is there a general growing fascination for the past, and how is it affecting the younger generation?
Yes, it can give comfort, but it can also ask questions.
I think over the years, the sentimental longing for the past has become such a huge deal that on the one hand we see the obsession in our film industry, as we talked about in the last episode, and on the other hand there seems to be an increasing amount of retro elements in music, fashion, video games and social media.
2021, almost ultra-realistic, hyper-realistic graphics available, and here we are praising cardboard box graphics.
It is not unusual and actually quite common to use vintage old aesthetics to the point where sometimes we're not only renouncing our modern technology, but mostly using it to create this kind of retro look. When it comes to the horror genre, the VHS style is used pretty much everywhere as a stylistic method to make things scarier. We got analog horror, found footage stuff, and this whole liminal spaces phenomenon. You know, these transitional, mostly abandoned locations that cause a feeling of uncanniness. Now, but the reason it has become a social media phenomenon is actually the most fascinating part about this.
What? Where have I seen this?
Don't know why it looks familiar, it just does. This is weird.
Besides just being creepy, liminal spaces are great examples of historical nostalgia or anemoia, the feeling of nostalgia for a time you've never even experienced. And this is actually a huge deal. I've seen this mentioned a lot on the internet.
Historical nostalgia is your longing for the past that lived before you were born, and actually that could go back hundreds and thousands of years. Nostalgia does have an anchor point in you, so there has to be some connection, and sometimes you won't be able to even find a source for it.
My point is actually, we're downright involving nostalgia in any kind of media today. We can not only see these in social media mysteries, but also in social media music culture.
Lo-fi is interesting because it's much less about taking old hip hop samples and just repurposing them. It's much more of like just a kind of chill style.
People like the coffee house, elevator, like waiting music, and just kind of like ambient music to listen to that's not just like actual ambient music.
Lo-fi hip-hop music is mainly associated with studying or relaxing without music too much in the focus. But again, here's the crucial thing about it. I recently saw a bunch of playlists with only lo-fi music, and it was kind of like titled with nostalgia for a time that we never experienced, kind of like that.
There's a big resurgence in interest in like 30s to 50s music, like the Fallout games really introduced people to like jazz and like the 50s, coffee at midnight in a diner. People are like, oh man, this is great.
While in the past, low fidelity in music recordings resulted out of necessity, the artificial produced crackling sound of an old tape recording in lo-fi hip-hop is imitating this lack of better technology by actually using modern technology. That's an integral part of lo-fi music. But what about these 90s VHS and anime references?
One of the kind of major influences of lo-fi was Toonami music. So Toonami was a programming block on a station called Cartoon Network. And in the 90s, they had Toonami and they showed like Samurai Jack and Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah, that is a major influence on lo-fi hip-hop.
media directly influencing media, and art referencing art, a typical symptom of our postmodern era according to author Frederick Jameson. And this is important because we can only know and construct the past through its representations and stereotypes in media.
What is history but turning brute events into narratives of some kind?
So, to understand how past aesthetics and concepts are so attractive to us that they're still haunting us today, I think we should be familiar with Jameson's idea of postmodernism.
Down the chimney he will come.
In the age of modernism during the early 20th century, there was a huge desire for the creation of new forms of art, philosophy, and social organization. They had new technologies, a growing industry, political revolutions, and a radical change in art and culture. Now we're living in the postmodern era. The age of digitalization and remixes. Art is filled with references, pastiche, parodies, and reinventions. And I think this is a crucial point when it comes to historical nostalgia. Our pop culture has evolved into a composition of various art forms, all from various time periods, the growing film and music industry, and the endless archive of media history on the internet.
It's not as weird to be nostalgic for 90s video game and media, especially when they're recycled all the time for you.
On the Nintendo Switch, you can play old games with Nintendo Switch Online. You can watch old shows on YouTube now. You can check out all this stuff.
We're ready to believe you.
I mean, we're still surrounded by the cultural detritus of the 90s.
During my childhood, I was consuming a lot of early to mid-90s anime, TV shows, and video games, even though I grew up in the 2000s and 2010s.
You win.
Media just has such a long durability that you will always get to consume content from before your time, and what's left behind at the end is only an idea of the past, which consists of stereotypes that define certain time periods. This is why music by The Weeknd sounds more 80s than the 80s, and this is why we can feel nostalgic or connected to a time we never experienced. Due to postmodern characteristics, we get to the point where we can almost claim to be familiar with any kind of storytelling, sound, or even design.
People who feel nostalgic, they also have a very positive approach and outlook towards life. Even though it comes with a little bit of a sadness, it prepares you for the future.
The future. Now it's getting really interesting.
Joining us now, New York Times opinion writer Ross Douthat.
We're stuck and we want to get back to the future that we once imagined we would have.
What does the nostalgia obsession and repetition of culture tell us about our society? What is this whole thing leading to?
I would like to present you the guest of tonight, Mr. Professor Mark Fisher.
There's even a deeper philosophical reason behind all of this, and it has a lot to do with our future.
The phrase that captured this for me is the slow cancellation of the future.
All of this cultural repetition might show us that we're slowly reaching a limit in cultural innovation. While focusing so much on the past, do we even return to the past in order to relive the hopes for a better future?
The end of history and the last man. What's it all about?
Well,